Most universities rely on rubrics for one primary task: objective, consistent grading. The instructor takes a stack of papers and processes them against a standardized set of criteria to assign a score. In higher education, classrooms represent a dense mix of cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Here, strict transparency acts as a theoretical equalizer, clearly mapping out exactly what the professor expects from every student. However, handing students a complete map of how their work will be scored triggers an unintended psychological reaction. Educational researchers identify this reaction as instrumentalism. When given a hyper-specific rubric, a student will naturally narrow their cognitive focus to merely check the explicitly provided boxes. The drive to explore, risk failure, or apply unique insights vanishes. Instead, the student optimizes entirely for compliance, ensuring they do exactly what the criteria demand to secure the grade, and absolutely nothing more. A tool originally introduced into the classroom to clarify the learning process actually devolves into a mechanism that constricts the student's intellectual development. The root of the problem lies in timing. Most rubrics are built for the assessment of learning, a terminal judgment handed down after the final product is already complete, and the cognitive work has stopped. To fix this, educators have to pull that assessment forward in the timeline, shifting towards assessment as learning. This requires the rubric to stop acting as a teacher-centric scoring tool, hidden until the end of the term, and start functioning as a student-centric instructional scaffold, used continuously throughout the project. To dismantle the grading trap, educators must abandon the practice of using rubrics as post-mortem grading ledgers. We have to rebuild them as active environments that force students to regulate their own thinking. To understand why standard rubrics fail to spark independent thought, we have to deconstruct their basic architecture. The educational researcher W. James Popham identified 3 essential features that define a traditional rubric. First, evaluative criteria, the specific factors determining work quality. Second, quality definitions, detailed descriptions explaining what skills the student must demonstrate. Finally, the scoring strategy, which maps these definitions to a rating scale. When this architecture is applied as a holistic rubric, the teacher scores the overall process in one broad stroke. It generates a final number, but completely starves the student of any targeted, specific feedback on their actual mistakes. Conversely, an analytic rubric breaks the assignment down into highly detailed components. Yet in practice, this often functions as a secret scoring sheet, deployed by the instructor only to justify the final grade. Both of these traditional architectures fail the student. Their structural constraints are entirely engineered to maximize the teacher's grading efficiency, completely ignoring the student's need for cognitive exploration. The structural antidote to this passive compliance is a different layout, the single-point rubric. This design strips away the matrix, listing criteria for one specific level, the baseline of proficiency. The left column is a completely blank space, reserved entirely for logging areas of concern. The right column remains empty, waiting for notes on where the student exceeded baseline requirements. The cognitive mechanics of this layout are precise. By deliberately removing any pre-written text defining advanced work, the rubric eliminates the ceiling cap on student performance. These wide open margins force the student out of a checkbox mentality. To aim high, they must actively generate their own pre-assessment narrative, setting personal goals for the assignment. Educational researchers refer to this necessary skill as evaluative judgment. Wrestling with that blank space forces the student to develop their own internal compass for assessing quality, rather than relying on the instructor's map. By weaponizing blank space, the single-point rubric forces the student out of passive instrumentalism and demands sophisticated, independent disciplinary thinking. Moving from theory to practice requires instructors to actively train students on how to engage with this open-ended architecture within the syllabus. One highly effective method is the mock critique. The instructor provides a published journal article or anonymized past assignment, and the class uses the rubric to interrogate the work, calibrating their understanding. Another approach is co-creation. The instructor presents the blank structure to the class and elicits the criteria directly from the students. Building the rubric together builds psychological ownership over the assessment process. This open architecture also perfectly engineers the peer assessment process. When students are required to write detailed diagnostic feedback in the blank margins of their peers' work, they exercise their own evaluative capacity. These implementation tactics physically shift the burden of assessment. The critical thinking moves away from the instructor's red pen and directly into the student's active cognitive processing. Shifting the cognitive load to the student reveals an entirely different dimension to rubric design. These tools evaluate the effectiveness of the instruction as much as the performance of the student. Educational scholars frame this concept as using the rubric as an instructional illuminator. This is a chart representing a teacher summary rubric. The y-axis tracks the specific assignment criteria, while the x-axis logs the class-wide summary of performance, categorizing whether students showed concerns, met the proficiency standard, or exceeded expectations. By running a cross-sectional analysis across this grid, the instructor analyzes aggregate data spanning multiple assignments, rather than focusing on any individual student's grade. Visual patterns emerge in this aggregated data, exposing specific, systemic weaknesses happening inside the classroom. Identifying a heavy concentration of errors on a single criterion allows educators to pinpoint exact syllabus omissions, revise ineffective teaching strategies, and modify future assignments to patch the gap. The aggregate rubric data acts as an objective diagnostic tool. It exposes the instructor's pedagogical blind spots and demands a cycle of continuous curriculum redesign. When we examine these elements together, the true purpose of assessment in higher education comes into focus. Outwardly, an open-ended rubric acts as a vital cognitive scaffold. It cures student instrumentalism by refusing to define the ceiling, forcing self-regulation and independent thought. Inwardly, the aggregate data flowing from those rubrics provides continuous, objective illumination of instructional flaws, holding the curriculum itself accountable. Assessment serves as the engine for the next cycle of learning. The modern educator must abandon the rubric as a terminal grading mechanism and instead wield it as the foundational architecture for assessment as learning.